Good morning, Mr. Sharma.
Good morning, my lady. We're starting a little later than usual, but we will complete Mr. Williams's questioning on time.
Okay, I'd like to take the Bible and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Mr. Williams, before I start asking you some questions, I understand there are some words which you wish to say.
Mr. Sharma, thank you. I'd just like to preface this session with an acknowledgement of the deep and enduring impact that the pandemic had on the people of this country. Those who were ill, the families of those who died, frontline staff in the NHS, social care, the third sector. It's the context clearly for this inquiry. It's also the context for the decisions that I and my teams in the Department of Health were making during the period that we are going to examine today. I've looked at the impact video for the start of this module and the depth of emotion and impact, not only from 5 years ago, but how present and real that remains with the families of those who died, with staff working on the front line, is, palpable and I think a really important context for evidence today. In the context of PPE, clearly there's an impact there around supply and confidence in our support to frontline staff delivering difficult work in really difficult circumstances and how they approached that job. Also an impact on families in terms of the ability of institutions to offer access to family members whilst maintaining infection control. And that's also a really important context for me for how good a job collectively we did. But I'd also just like to acknowledge that staff working on these deals, staff supporting the department in its rapid procurement work, were themselves dealing with the daily ins and out of the disease. They were either ill themselves or had family members who were ill, dealing with the consequences of lockdown, all of those stresses in their private life alongside really demanding work. The impact directly of COVID-19, the impact through displacement of other healthcare, the impact of lockdown on social mental health well-being, as well as the economic impact, is the backdrop in the end for a range of decisions that we were making at the time. And I expect we will explore that more fully in the session ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Could I begin, please, with the two witness statements you've provided to the inquiry? They are INQ 000475015 and INQ 000475014. Would you be kind enough to confirm they're true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are, yes.
To begin by your background, you are, I understand, a civil servant by career. You first joined the Ministry of Defence in 1990. And it is there that you've spent the majority of your career, is that right?
That's correct.
In 2015, you were the Director General of Finance and Group Operations at DHSC, is that right?
That's correct.
And on the 5th of March 2020, you were made the second Permanent Secretary at DHSC.
That's also correct.
And since the 6th of April of 2021, you have been the Permanent Secretary back at the Ministry of Defence.
Correct.
Just to begin, please, with your role as a second Permanent Secretary and then your role as an accounting officer, could you please explain to the inquiry what that entailed during the pandemic?
Yes. So, look, I was a member of the senior leadership team of the Department of Health and Social Care during the period that you have set out. So my role as second permanent secretary was both providing direct support to Sir Chris Wormold as permanent secretary in the sort of full range of activity that the department was undertaking. Ensuring in terms of my sort of pre-pandemic responsibilities that the department itself was organised and able to deal with the various aspects of COVID-related regulations, so how we were supporting remote working, how we were managing social distancing within the workplace, ensuring the department itself was able to function whilst being compliant with the sort of COVID rules of the day. Operating as part of the senior leadership team in setting direction for the department, supporting staff in their work, ensuring that we were able to onboard the resources that we had, and then specifically as an additional accounting officer, responsible for a range of procurement and other activity through the pandemic, including rapid procurement of ventilators, of PPE, procurement of capacity, whether that was lab capacity, through to individual test kits to support the NHS Test and Trace programme, as well as broader financial support, close working with NHS England and other parts of the system.
Thank you very much, but I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that's right.
But just to place your role in context, we are going to focus this morning on one part of your role, which is as an accounting officer, but also acknowledging that whilst you were an accounting officer, you had a number of other important responsibilities within the Department for Health and Social Care.
Yes, that's correct. No one day was ever really quite the same.
The inquiry has heard evidence from another accounting officer, Mr. Young, and has also received written evidence from the third accounting officer, Mr. Fundry. Just in terms of the differences between the three of you, it's right, isn't it, that your authorisations in terms of being an accounting officer were those above £100 million, and those for Mr. Young and Mr. Fundry were for those below £100 million. Is that right?
That's correct. I was formally appointed additional accounting officer by Chris Wormold, and that brings with it a degree of personal accountability to Parliament. Mr. Young and Mr. Fundry were both directors working for me, and I delegated those responsibilities below 100 million in the way that you have set out.
Just focusing in on that relationship between you, Mr. Young, and Mr. Fundry, were you working collectively in those decisions to make accounting approvals, or were they personally dealt with by you? How did it work on a day-to-day basis?
So, look, they were professional, highly competent officials in whom I had a lot of trust. For issues, for deals below that £100 million threshold, they had freedom and flexibility to sign those deals off without reference to me. But we were engaging and working closely together on a day-to-day basis. And if they had concerns or they wanted some guidance from me, they would raise them. Some of the deals that came to me would have been through their assessment before they came to me. Some of them came to me because the price or volume of the deal changed, which meant that it came above the threshold. So we had distinct responsibilities, but we worked closely together in a climate I would describe as a high degree of professional trust.
In terms of the numbers of contracts and volume, the vast majority were below the £100 million threshold, and so they were approved by Mr. Fundry and Mr. Young. You, by contrast, estimate that you were only involved in about 10 contracts. Is that right?
Yeah, about 10 is what I've said in my statement. It might be a few more than that, but I'd be surprised if it was more than 20.
Managing public money, please. We've covered this a little bit with Mr. Young, so hopefully I can deal with it with you briefly. The principles of managing public money, we don't need to bring them up. Regularity, propriety, value for money, feasibility and deliverability. They're the principles that Mr. Young said he was abiding by. It's the same with you, isn't it?
Yep, it's the same set of principles, although clearly, as an accounting officer, you bring an element of personal judgment to how those principles are applied.
You make reference in your written statement, it's page 6, paragraph 18 and 19, to two practical ways in which managing public money had to be applied. You make reference to the application of sheer common sense as being one of the criteria or one of the principles that you brought to bear. Is that right?
Yes, indeed, managing public money itself says that nothing in that guidance should get in the way of actually applying common sense to the decisions that accounting officers are making.
And you also make the observation from managing public money that the rules cannot be set for every situation or every circumstance, and that's where what you've described as your judgment being critical.
Absolutely. And look, clearly the circumstances of the pandemic were unprecedented. And so whilst the principles themselves remained unchanged, how they were applied, the judgments that we made, the risk appetite that we had was not static through this period.
Bearing that in mind, do you recall any of the PPE contracts which arrived on your desk that you didn't approve?
By the time they got to me, deals had been through quite a rigorous process of commercial evaluation, quality assurance and technical evaluation, deal making and financial assurance. So normally if there were issues that would have prompted me to want to say no, they wouldn't have come to me. So I can't immediately think of any deals that I personally rejected. I can think of deals where I've asked for further clarification or confirmation of the terms or confirmation of the requirement.
You also refer in your written evidence to relying not only on the content of the AO packs, i.e. the frontispiece and then all of the documents that come behind it, but also on steers from Mr. Maron and Dame Emily Lawson. Could you help us, please, with what steer or what assistance they provided you in the assessment of deals?
So one of the important inputs to that accounting officer judgment is an understanding of the requirement. And what I really looked to Dr. Lawson and Mr. Maron jointly was their understanding, their confirmation that there was a requirement for the PPE that we were buying within the timescales that we expected it to deliver. Dr. Lawson also brought an element of additional sort of commercial nous to the recommendations alongside the teams working below us.
Setting aside just for a moment the individuals that you worked with, to focus on a theme throughout this module, which is value for money.
Yeah.
That being one of the principles in managing public money and also critical in your assessment of the deals and the contracts which landed on your desk. In terms of value for money, one of the areas in which DHSC worked was on something called price benchmarking. Could you help the inquiry, please, with what price benchmarking is and how that assisted in your determination of the deals?
Yeah, if I might, understanding that time is precious, let me just take one step back, though. At the macro level, and we had set out in advice to the Secretary of State in late March, look, in a world where at its peak, hundreds of people were dying every day, there was an impact on society through lockdown and deep economic cost. a willingness to spend money in the expectation or the anticipation that it might shorten the pandemic or shorten lockdown by a week was money well spent and a risk that I was willing to take. So that's the macro context for the value for money of decisions that we were making. But within that, what you wanted to understand was whether deal A was a better prospect than deal B if you had more than one option in front of you. Price benchmarking was a way in a really volatile global market where prices were fluctuating, escalating materially, was a way of understanding how the price of a deal in front of us related to the average price that we might have been paying over the previous week or the previous 14 days. It was an important financial input into the decision making, not the only one. The level of prepayment, for instance, was also a factor. And the financial calculus was itself only one element that I or Mr. Fundry or Mr. Young will have assessed in coming to our accounting officer judgment.
And just to make sure the price is not taken out of context, as it might be, you refer in your statement, similar to what you've just described to the inquiry, that your decision having been taken and considered in the round, and of the factors that you and others were taking into account, you refer to the existing stock levels, the quantity of the offer, the apparent quality of the equipment being procured, the price for which price benchmarking is relevant, the delivery time, and the particular terms and conditions, for example, in relation to prepayment. And you were making a judgment call as an AO in respect of each of those criteria to weigh up the offer.
Yes, that's correct. And look, in early April, where we were particularly worried about stock levels, and you could see the impact that distribution challenges was having on frontline staff and their concerns about availability of PPE at the ward level rather than at the national level, a focus on timeliness of supply and our confidence of actually getting our hands on the PPE was a more important factor than simple price benchmarking. Later in the process, as we had built up a greater resilience in days or weeks of supply, then some of that calculus would change.
Could we have a look, please, at a document INQ 000 496 719? Thank you. This is PP buy-sell pricing benchmarks. This one is issued on the 20th of May, data from the 15th of May. If we could turn to page 2, please. And if we have a look, setting aside the chart on the left to one side, on the right-hand side, looking down the column at gowns, thank you. And what this is setting out are the sorts of prices in the first box, the unit price in Q4 2019, so the price pre-pandemic effectively, looking at the average unit price between April and May, £2.69, and then the changes in prices, 156%. So I just want to have a look at that, and if we turn forward, please, to page 3. And just to zoom in, please, we're going to look at gowns and coveralls in the examples we're looking at. So if we zoom in, please, to the top. Again, the price pre-pandemic, £7.33, and then the increase in price, which is seen in April and May, to £16.32, and then the 6-week pricing development, 123%. And then I'm going to ask you some questions about this, but just to provide context to the fluctuations in prices that you describe, could we have a look, please, at page 31? This is for gowns, and this is showing in that chart the ranges of prices which are being paid for gowns from March through to May. with the weighted average there represented by the blue line going up and down. This is what you're describing by looking at the range of prices which are available and price benchmarking. Is that right?
Yes, I mean this was a report done, as you say, in May. We would look at reports like that. We would also just look at knowledge that the team had about what were the deals that we had signed off in the previous week, what were the prices there, and of course it was also relevant about what were the prices being offered, what could we negotiate down on the deals that we had in front of us. I mean, just on this particular table, two slight caveats, although I think the general picture of price volatility and substantial increases in prices across all categories of PPE during this period is that it's not fully data cleansed for whether or not the deal included shipping. So a deal without transport would be cheaper than a deal with, and if you were really worried about early delivery and you were air freighting, then the price would be different than if you were shipping. Within the gowns category, this covers non-sterile and sterile gowns, and as you might imagine, the price for sterile gowns is higher. It is illustrative of the kind of market we were operating in. It is illustrative of the fluctuation in prices. In particular, you can see a lot of that in that first phase of late March through to end of April, early May. But if you wanted to know why there's a spike in prices right at the end of April, beginning of May, then you would need to look at all of the other factors that went into the decision.
We're going to come on to some of those factors as we look at some of the AO packs. Just to make it clear, I'm not suggesting as we go through these AO packs that this document was available to the person who was considering them. And in fact, just to follow on from the point that you've just made, in terms of the information available to you as the accounting officer, or indeed to Mr. Fundry and Mr. Young, clearly it wasn't this document. This summarises what the situation was over the course of the previous month. How were you able to make assessments about whether the prices per unit were offering value for money for the items on the AO packs which you considered and authorised?
So we would have in the packs, obviously an indication of the price in the deal, together with information on either the price that we've been paying over the previous week or 2 weeks, or what the price had been in the last sort of handful of deals that had been agreed. We'd also have a benchmark about other deals that were in the offing. So the PPE buy team would be managing more than one prospective deal at any one time, so they could see what the range of market prices at that time would be. But of course, we would then also have information on those other factors as we have discussed. So there was, I would say, reasonable data on pricing, but not perfect.
And also subject to many of those caveats which you've illustrated, so shipping being the most obvious.
Yeah.
In terms of the information available to you as the AO, the description that we have had from Mr. Marin is that the deals were making their way through the 8-stage process before they arrived on your desk for authorisation. Is that broadly right?
That's broadly right, yes.
In terms of the visibility that you had on other deals that may be coming down the pipeline, what did that look like and how did that factor into your decision-making and those of Mr. Fundry and Mr. Young?
So firstly, a deal for my agreement or authorisation wouldn't just, it did end up in my inbox, but it wouldn't just end up in my inbox without any notice. There would be engagement with the team about, we have a deal coming to you, we're expecting to get you to buy here. These are the kind of things that we are currently looking at. There would be data available. I mean, I did not attend the sort of daily stand-ups of the PPE buy team, but there was data available in the system, and from time to time I would engage with it on the range of deals that were also in development. Sometimes, not often, normally I would be given a single deal to sign off, but sometimes I would be given a note which said, we've been pursuing 3 deals, we recommend these 2, but for reference, here is the 3rd that we now propose not to take forward.
Thank you. Let's look at some practical examples, please. And as we go through them, I'm not suggesting in any way that these are the ones that you'd considered. I'd just like to hear your reflections, please, on the information which was available to the AO, particularly around price benchmarking and the categorisation of the items being offered. They are all, just so that you're clear, they're all about either gowns or coveralls.
Okay.
And we've just seen the 2 prices up on the screen a moment ago. Have in your mind, please, that April to May average gown price was £2.69, and the average price for coveralls was £16.32, just as we go through this so that we can obtain your reflections. Could we have up on screen, please, INQ 000 521 800? Thank you. If we can zoom in, please, to the bottom. We've just been informed, thank you. We've just been informed that there is an extreme shortage on gowns and coveralls. If we can expedite this offer through, then when would you be able to deliver as a matter of urgency, like tonight? Just before we unpack this, in terms of gowns and coveralls, from your perspective, were they interchangeable? Was there demand for one or less demand for another? Did that change during the course of the early stage of the pandemic?
They were interchangeable to the extent that if you didn't have access to gowns, then a coverall would be acceptable. But on the whole, what we were focusing coverall purchase on, as far as I recall, was on specific workforce groups. So paramedics, for instance, people out and about, in and out of ambulances, needing more movement. Coveralls allowed them to perform the full range of their tasks without constantly having to put gowns on and off. So
I'm sorry, I ought to have done this at the beginning, but just in very brief layman's terms, please, the difference between a gown and a coverall.
I'm probably at the layman end of the spectrum here as well. We were buying aprons, which were, as they think, one size fits all, covers the front of body, ties at the back. We were buying gowns, both non-sterile, really for protection and general usage, sterile for use in surgical situations, which would have more of an arm to it, would be closer fitting, and provide greater coverage. Coveralls are more like I'm trying to avoid saying a sort of a onesie, which is now the only word I can get in my mind. But trousers, legs, zip, arms. So quite a different product. Now, if you had an absence of lower spec but satisfactory products, you could always use a higher spec one. But on the whole, on coveralls, we were buying those to target to particular work groups that needed that level of flexibility, freedom of movement, and just the capability that the coverall offered.
For the purposes of the questions I'm going to ask you, there are differences, aren't there, between the prices paid for each of those 2 categories of gowns, as you described, sterile, non-sterile, and then separately again in respect of coveralls. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Could we have a look, please, at INQ 000 521 799? And if we can zoom in, please, to market price assessment. Thank you. Just going to go through some of these documents quite quickly. So normal prices, including for gowns, £1.57. Negotiated unit price in this case is £8. And then you mentioned there the shipping cost. And then if we can look at the final sentence, forgive me. It then says at the bottom that the delivered unit price for these protective coveralls is average compared with other recent purchases. And then if we can turn over to page 2. Thank you. And then at the very bottom, make all reasonable attempt to ensure prices at the very bottom box. Make all reasonable attempt to ensure prices are below 25% above the average unit price paid to date. No price exceeds 25%. Just on this document, it refers to gowns, and then it refers to protective coveralls, and then it refers to benchmarking, and trying to come within below the 25% limit. What are your reflections if you had a document like this in terms of what it was may have been being bought, what inquiries would be made to make sure that the benchmarking was at the right product at the right price?
So, look, without knowing which deal this is, what I take from the extracts that you've shown is that this was for a purchase for a blend of gowns and coveralls, and as we've explored, there was quite a range between the average prices for those two distinct items. What I don't have here is a feel for the relative volumes within this deal of those two different types of product. I think the language at the end of that paragraph that you showed around for the protective coverall element, it being broadly in line with average prices. And of course, the point about an average price is that sometimes you will be buying below, sometimes you will be buying above. Look, there is information here. There will be more information in the supporting packs. But depending on the date and the timing, factors like the level of stock, our confidence in inflow from other deals, the timeliness of delivery here, our confidence in the supplier, was this a new supplier or somebody that we had used before, would all be relevant. The level of upfront payment, for example, all of that would be relevant to the decision, and price benchmarking was an important and interesting input to that. Rarely on its own was it decisive, certainly in the cases where by the time they came to me. But there are equally examples of the buy team, the clearance board, rejecting deals on basis of price, using price benchmarking.
And forgive me, the clearance board is an entity that came into being on about the 4th of May, is that right?
Yes, that was established in early May.
And the purpose of that was to provide an additional level of assurance, a sort of 9th stage in the process, is that right? So
an additional level of insurance, in part prompted by some conversations we've been having with the government banking service about their nervousness of it's a necessary feature of the deals that we were doing, but multi-hundred million dollar deals in a foreign country, in a foreign currency, with substantial prepayment into third countries through suppliers with not much track record is, if you have any sort of fraud detection system, we'll set all of those bells running. And of course, those were issues that we were grappling with ourselves. But in conversation with the government banking service over that first bank holiday weekend, we agreed to establish this additional level of clearance. And indeed, we got a better flow of information with the banks themselves about their understanding of some of the counterparties that we were dealing with. And so for somebody in your position, after the 4th of May of 2020, presumably that's another level of assurance. It's been through another
group of people looking at the contract. Is that right?
Absolutely. And look, it was 3 of our most senior commercial officers and then the finance lead, deputy director level, working for John and Chris, who in the end made the payments.
Thank you. Another example, please. INQ 000560854. This is another April 20 deal. We've seen these documents in part before with Mr. Young. These are the documents which summarise, don't they, the content of the AO pack and the material features of the transaction for your review or for the review of the other AOs. Here it says the unit price delivered for gowns on page 1 is £8.20 to £8.40. Forgive me, if we could turn over the page to page 2. That's it, thank you. The market price assessment. Again here, the guide price for coverall stroke gowns is £1.57 and the negotiated delivery unit price is £8.20 and £8.45. Recent orders for gowns have been £6 delivered, so under the current conditions, the negotiated delivered unit prices are deemed to be reasonable. If we could turn over to page 3. And then zoom into the average unit price.
£6, Mr. Sharma. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, I'm sorry.
16.
Forgive me, £16. Thank you, my lady. And if we turn over to page 3, average unit price paid to date for these items. And as my lady has observed, the gowns, the average UK price paid is £10.30. Though recent purchases have been £16 delivered, this price is favourable. And so, again, in this document, a conflation between gowns and coveralls, it seems.
Yep.
And yet, if we were looking at the benchmarking for gowns and coveralls, they'd be quite different, wouldn't they?
Well, yes. So one, I mean, the benchmarking data that you showed earlier takes a longer time frame. So it will start from late March, where before we saw an awful lot of the price escalation. So that's not necessarily comparing like with like, though it's a point of reference. As I said in my sort of responses earlier, benchmarking in the terms of the deals that we're doing against ones that we had recently done and our most recent experience of prices over the previous week or 2 weeks was really effectively how we were doing this. In this particular case, if it's the one I think I am, but I won't say which one I think it is. There was a particular.
Just so that it's clear, the reason why you're not is because it's been.
No, I know, at our request, that's right.
Commercially sensitive information. So
yes.
Yeah.
So without going into any commercially sensitive information, I think this deal came up at a time where we were both concerned about the successful inflow of deals that we had already done. We were concerned about constraint on raw material supply in the future, and therefore had one eye not only on the price that we had been paying, but where we thought the market might go in the future. And at that moment in time, this was a decent price.
Thank you. We'll come on to the assessment of all of the criteria in respect of these transactions at the end, if we may.
Yep.
Could I move on, please, to another example? INQ 000569902. And page 1 again, if we zoom in, please, to value and price. The average unit price for gowns is £11.07, with the minimum price being paid £3.75 and the maximum price being paid £31.50. This unit price of £7.79 is therefore below the average price paid. Initially, the supplier proposed £7.90 per unit, but I was able to reduce this to £7.79. Here an example, is it not, of an enormous range of prices for the item. If you were going to benchmark this item, would you benchmark it against gowns, or does this look more like a benchmark against coveralls?
Well, what I don't know is whether the 31.50 was a coverall price. So again, I think this is the summary here is probably conflating gowns and coveralls, but you would expect more detailed information to be available in the supporting pack.
Could we have a look, please, at another example, 569906. And if we zoom into the box at the bottom, the price per unit, £7.20, no VAT. In this case, it includes the shipment, so that factor of the shipment has to be taken into account with this one. The minimum price revealed has been £3.76, and again, maximum £31.50, with an average unit price of £17.63. The price of £7.20 per unit is competitive when considering the recent prices received to date. It may be just a feature of this particular AO pack, but here it looks like in order to arrive at the average unit price, what's happened is that someone has added the £3.76 and the £31.50, and then they've divided it by 2, and then arrived at £17.63. That's what it looks like. I don't know whether that's a coincidence or not, but just in terms of the price again, £31.50. Here, potentially the conflation of gowns with coveralls again, bearing in mind the higher price that's on here.
Yeah, I mean, conceivably, I mean, you're right. £17.63 is indeed an average of those two numbers, and the information we were looking at earlier was a weighted average, which is when you are taking a longer-term view for a benchmark. I would agree, I think, with your inference that that's probably more useful, a useful point. Look, I mean, I think the challenge with all of this sort of retrospective price benchmarking is that it was an input into the decision making, but in the end, the price that really mattered was what you could actually do a deal for. Had we been able to negotiate the price down, were there other offers that were available with similar quantities, quality, delivery timescales, and the ability to pay at what the price had been 2 weeks previously simply wasn't there. So was the data perfect? No, we were making decisions at pace with imperfect data. On the data that we had, I would stand by, the majority, if not all of the decisions that we made. But it was the nature of the environment in which we were operating that these deals were being done with the best data we had available.
But please don't infer from the questions I'm asking you that I'm not accepting the pressure and the pace at which you and your team had to work, and of course the requirement to get PPE to the front line of the NHS and social care. The purpose of this is so that, as we'll turn to in a moment, we can find out if there's a better way of doing this in the future. Just one final example, please. It's one we've looked at before in the inquiry. It's INQ 000512396. And if we can turn to page 1, and at the bottom, the description of the goods, coverall suit, non-sterile. If we can zoom into that, please. There, the prices are expressed in dollars. If we can zoom out again, please. And then over the page to market price assessment. current price of PPE, irrespective of the item, is increasing daily. 700,000 coverall suits. And then if we can turn over to page 3. If we can zoom in, please, to average unit price paid to date for these items. £19.26, average for coveralls to date on an ex-works basis. An ex-works, is that a reference again to the logistics, to the cost of transport? Or is that
So I think that would be from the factory, excluding transport.
Thank you. And then just underneath, this is a slightly different example, because in this case it says gowns, which is what's in demand,
Yep.
with coveralls as a substitute. And it's the gowns that are in a stock critical position, but the decision here is taken to acquire coveralls. And then if we can zoom out again, and then on the 25% criteria, make all reasonable attempt to ensure prices are below 25%. Yes, prices are within the 25% ratio. Just to pause on this one for a moment. Here, the demand data was that what ought to be being acquired were gowns with coveralls only as a substitute. Is that right?
Yes. So as I said previously, we were trying to target coveralls at those workforce groups that specifically needed them, but where there were critical shortages, using better quality against more demanding specs, PPE as a substitute for other products was an approach that we would take.
Could I ask you a question, please, about the price benchmarking of a transaction such as this, in which the item which is in demand is gowns, but the item which is being procured is coveralls? If you were to price benchmark this transaction against that for gowns, one would end up with the conclusion that this is significantly above the price being paid for gowns, broadly speaking, with the figure in mind that I referred to at the beginning of the questioning.
You would. So I would imagine that the factors in signing this one off were extremely low levels of gowns and the inability to secure gown supply in a timely enough fashion
So
at the quantities that we need.
Of course. So someone in your position, in order to make the, forgive me for saying that the assumption, of course it is, because we're looking at this here, that in order to make the decision as to whether you were going to acquire gowns or coveralls in this situation, you'd have to make a judgment based on the data available to you that there are no other gowns being offered to you at the usual gowns price. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
If I may, I think at that period in mid-April, and I think you have this in other witness statements, the deals that were being pursued, a number of them, you would have our 8:30 stand-up meeting. A number of those deals would have fallen overnight because the stock would have been bought up by somebody else. So it was a very dynamic, fluid market. Purchase of, if you like, over-spec'd PPE to ensure that we had some stock, even if it's more expensive than ideally we would have liked, I think in the circumstances is a reasonable judgment.
Of course, and accepting what you said a moment ago about the pressure and the pace and the fact that this was a system which had to buy that which was presented to it. I mean, that was the way that it worked, was it not?
Essentially, yes. That was the one of the challenges that we were dealing with, is that we were processing and evaluating a very large quantity of bids into the system, rather than it being a targeted pursuit of deals that we thought would deliver. I mean, in fact, it was a blend of those approaches across this period, but for the parallel supply chain in particular, it was essentially dealing with offers that were made to us.
If we were going to look at this price benchmarking system now to plan for a pandemic in the future, would it not be preferable to have more granular detail about the categories of the offers and the specificity of each of the items being supplied, so that the price benchmarking could be more accurate?
Well, look, I mean, generally speaking, this area, I think having better data, would clearly be helpful, accepting that in a crisis there's always going to be some limitations on it. Yes, if you were looking at, as I think I suggested on the overarching document that you shared previously, understanding whether the deal has got logistics costs in or is simply the purchase price, understanding the differentiation between types of PPE within an aggregated description is important if you really want to make the most of price benchmarking. I think it was sort of adequate just about for its purposes based on the fact that it was only one element of the input into the decision making that we were taking, and it's possible that even with more granular information that the decisions we would have made would have been the same.
That's very fair. If I could ask you finally this question about value for money.
Yeah.
In terms of making the decision of somebody in your position with all of that information available to you, weighing up all of those different factors, do you think or do you know of a system by which all of that information could be automated and weighted and triaged so that you're only able to focus on the most important data, so that you know, for example, in a transaction whether the risk on this transaction is price or the risk on the transaction is in terms of due diligence?
There are definitely lessons that we can make about the system support that we had in this area, not least because we were bringing together teams from different government departments who were used to working with different systems. I think by the end of this sort of phase in the summer of 2020, as we'd introduced in the Department of Health a new Atomis system, that was actually not a bad place. But having joined up IT that both allows you to manage and triage and track the offers that we are getting, monitor their progress through the system, and give you decent price information and other information on what has then been done with those deals. Getting that in and training on it as part of preparedness for a future pandemic would absolutely be in my kind of recommendations for the future. A single system that in the end can boil down all of the factors that an AO needs to worry about. I think, as I've hoped to say, is the judgment in the end is quite contextual, and the factors that weighed more heavily with me in the deals that I was looking at in early April were not quite the same as the factors that I was weighing in late May or June, and not quite the same for PPE as when I was thinking about lateral flow test procurement or whatever. So,
would I be summarising it fairly if I said that what changed was that the weighting of those factors changed, so that whereas perhaps at the beginning of the pandemic the requirement was to just buy as much as possible because of the scarcity of the resource, whereas later on a slightly different approach could be taken once stockpiles had been built up?
Well, both about stockpiles, but also, and I come back to that point about my engagement with Jonathan Marin and Emily Lawson, the requirement based on our expectations of demand was genuinely difficult to predict, based on modelling about how we thought the pandemic would progress. And obviously in that first wave, we were learning clinically about the pandemic, as well as about how it evolved. Nor did we have good usage data to start off with, particularly from the NHS and from the social care system. Indeed, we went into this without really having a comprehensive view of holdings of PPE across the NHS at the national, regional and local level. So there are a number of ways in which the data can be tidied up for the future.
Mr. Williams, thank you very much. I don't have any further questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Ms. Mitchell, I think you have a question.
Yes, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID Bereaved. It's a matter which you touched on towards the end of your evidence in relation to recommendations, where you were talking about suitable IT to manage and triage and track offers. We've heard evidence in the inquiry that people were being taken away from the job that they needed to do to answer queries that were being given to people. And my question had been for you, should it have been made clear that after referrals there ought not to have been any more feedback, as it took people away from the job they should have been doing? Now, I imagine your answer to that is probably yes.
Probably yes. So let me just very briefly expand on that. I mean, there was important contact with suppliers, sometimes through referrers, in order to fill in gaps in the information that had been provided, to ensure that we had the best information available. As far as possible, you would want those contacts to be initiated by the PPE team rather than responding to in some cases, quite a range of, I think, unreasonable pressure for updates on progress.
It's really the latter that I was thinking.
So look, evidence into the system, responding to queries from ministers, senior officials, that kind of wider stakeholder management, I think, is a legitimate part of the process. If we had better, a sort of CRM type system, a better IT system that would allow that information to be generated automatically rather than through manual intervention. I think that's where we need to be next time round. I think my personal regret is that some of the, I think, bordering on, I mean, I understand the context, but bordering on unacceptable behaviour and pressure that was being put on members of the buy team in particular, while some of it was escalated to senior officials working for me, not much of that got to me very early in the period. And I think senior engagement with some suppliers or with some of the more persistent referrers to say, enough now. So whether it's a guidance or a set of protocols, or whether actually what it needed was senior intervention to say, you just got to stop, we're going to process the deal, it's going to be assessed fairly against criteria, we'll come back to you when we need more information. I personally regret that I wasn't more in that space. In some ways, it's only preparing for some of the session today and some of the witness statements that I've fully appreciated some of that pressure that my team were under.
I'm obliged, my lady. The witness has answered in advance the rest of the questions that I wish to answer.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. That completes our questioning for you, Mr Williams. Can I ask, you were brought in March 2020 from the MOD. Had there been a second permanent secretary at the DHSC, or were you brought in specially because of COVID, or was it coincidence, or what happened?
No, I was already working in the Department of Health, so I left the Ministry of Defence in 2015 and had been working there as a Director General. I was then bumped up to second PUS in role, not least to bring those sort of formal accounting officer responsibilities alongside Chris Wormold.
Thank you. So I misunderstood the dates. I thought you'd arrived just before the impact of COVID was being appreciated, but obviously you've been there before.
It was, however, I think the first time the department had a second permanent secretary, and there have been two since me. There is a current role there still.
Thank you. And can I just say this? I know you don't need me to add it, but I think you're entirely right to emphasise the really difficult circumstances that people were under. I think some people have been inclined to forget how difficult it was to work from a back room at home without access to your colleagues, under huge pressure, and trying obviously to get PPE out to save lives and protect people. So may I thank you and your colleagues for everything that was done to try and get the equipment out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Williams. And that, I think, completes the evidence, Mr Sharma. I've been asked to break now because there are one or two things that need to be done, apparently, before we start closing submissions. So I shall return at 25 past. Mr Mr Wald.
My lady, before we turn to closing submissions, and very briefly, there are two matters on which I would be grateful for your assistance. The first is that in the evidence just now, a document was brought up on screen which contained unredacted commercially sensitive information. We would therefore be grateful if you would grant a restriction order over the sensitive information within that document. And the document reference is INQ 000521800.
I do.
Thank you, my lady. The second matter is that there is additional material that we ask your permission to adduce into evidence and to be published on the inquiry's website. That material runs to 14 items and includes some additional evidence in relation to the Mellor contract. If I could ask that the list of documents be brought up on the screen now. Thank you. The material provides important additional and contextual information, which it is anticipated will assist you, my lady, when considering the evidence that you have heard in this investigation and for your report.
Those documents may be published. Thank you.
My lady, thank you. I think we then move on to closing submissions.
Thank you. Morris, I think you're up first.
Thank you, my lady. My lady, my submissions on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK start with reminding you that at the heart of this module is the stark reality that there was a failure by the Westminster government to protect the NHS and save lives for the provision of adequate PPE. Politicians have told this inquiry that only they lived in the real world, which the rest of us could never understand in terms of the pressures, decisions and difficult phone calls they had to make in the procurement exercise. They claim that this was an unmitigated success and they would not do anything differently. However, the inquiry has heard clear evidence from the real world that clinicians and carers lived in, that the supply of PPE to staff across the health and care sectors was, as Professor Banfield from the BMA said, woefully inadequate. This is despite the UK government spending £8.6 billion of public money on PPE, but the government's inadequate preparedness and inefficient procurement systems resulted in a £3.8 billion of wasted PPE that could not be used in the NHS. In the real world, this meant that there were patients, clinicians, health and social care workers exposed to preventable infections from COVID-19. Daniel Mortimer described his members being unable to ensure the safety of their staff. Primary care members reported having to rely on local shops, beauty and tattoo parlours to access PPE supplies, at times having to use crowdfunding to buy equipment. In the real world, this meant that people were prevented from seeing their loved ones in hospitals and care homes. In the real world, clinicians were faced with difficult choices as to how to treat patients. And as Professor Munasinghe recognised, it is possible that the pressure of a lack of essential life-saving equipment like ventilators may have changed the way that clinicians thought about how to escalate some critical care patients, something that many of the families that we represent experienced. But, my lady, the cost of inadequate PPE was not just to people, but to the public purse. In simple terms, every pound we overpaid for PPE or wasted on contracts for defective PPE was a pound that could have been spent on the health and social care sector. The UK paid an unacceptably high COVID premium for its PPE. Chris Young told the inquiry that the Cargo Services Far East contract was 900% above benchmark price. The DHSC told their accounting officers only that they should make, quote, best attempts to stay within the 25% rolling benchmark. And there was also a price to the waste of PPE on a scale that, according to Lord Agnew, blocked the Felixstowe docks. There was an estimated £4 billion of wasted PPE that had to be disposed of or stored, and at a continuing cost to the public purse. My lady, the root cause of this failure in the procurement response was a failure of preparedness. As Professor Munasinghe told the inquiry, we were woefully unprepared even for what was thought to be the reasonable worst-case scenario. There were insufficient stockpiles and a lack of centralised data in respect of what was held by trusts in England or nationally. Any stockpiles that were held were modelled on an influenza pandemic and were difficult to access in deep storage. The NHS supply chain was only ever designed as a business as usual process with no contingency planning in place for the increased burdens of a pandemic. My lady, there was a price for this poor preparation. The total lack of preparedness meant that when the pandemic hit, the DHSC were what Lord Agnew described as rabbits in the headlights. Professor Sanchez-Graels was clear that at the outset of the pandemic in the UK, the government had a perfectly good legal framework and procedures for procurement, including emergency procurement. But because of a lack of preparedness, the system was quickly overwhelmed. And when it became overwhelmed, there was a choice. A choice whether to follow a rule-based, transparent and accountable process, to develop a data-led foundation to identify what was needed and to follow a principled and consistent approach to inviting, managing and processing offers. But those in power took an opportunity, as Lord Bethell said, to take away the 100 years of conditioning within the civil service. No more cautious Charlies, as Mr Gove characterised. There was a new risk appetite set by the Prime Minister, Mr Hancock, to take a more buccaneering approach and throw the constraints of existing good procurement processes overboard. This whatever it takes approach by the DHSC undoubtedly influenced the speed at which offers to the PPE buy-sell were processed, the time spent on due diligence and the price the government was prepared to pay. But as Mr Rhys-Williams told the inquiry, the government's call to arms only increased the overwhelm and caused huge problems. At the heart of the failure to prepare was the lack of direct relationships with the PPE manufacturers or larger retail wholesalers. This meant that the UK simply didn't know where to turn to scale up supply. And into that void, aided and encouraged by the call to arms, stepped numerous intermediaries and agents. These new entrants into the PPE market moved quicker than the UK government to locate the manufacturers and secure supply, sometimes gazumping the government in the process, thereby further contributing to the global supply pressures and price increase, whilst enabling those intermediaries to make massive profits from the pandemic. My lady, there was undoubtedly a roaring noise of people offering PPE, all with differing motives, some philanthropic, some motivated by profit. Professor Sanchez-Graels said at this point, the senior leadership of the PPE buy-sell should have taken appropriate steps to reassure all those making offers that their offers were being considered and reduce the pressure on the buy-sell. This was what he called the legitimate operational requirement. This would have allowed them to develop and apply a consistent and criteria-based approach to rapidly triaging offers. It could and should have maintained a single point of entry and built capacity to triage those offers. Of course, my lady, we accept there must be a way of triaging offers to enable the quick identification of legitimate offers. Companies that already supply the NHS, already made PPE, or were large global suppliers of goods would have made it to the front of any sensible triage. The choice instead was to create a VIP lane that allowed politically exposed people to jump to the front of the queue and to expose those civil servants working in the PPE buy-sell to unbearable pressure. This was what Professor Sanchez-Graels said was dealing with the problem in the worst possible way. There is no question that the VIP lane was unlawful. Having already lost 2 legal cases and with levels of public concern still high from what has been revealed in open source material and other investigations about profiteering and cronyism, those at the heart of the scandal had another choice to make at this inquiry. Act with candour, finally accept the failures of the systems they created and assist the inquiry with forward-looking recommendations for how best to perform emergency procurement to inform our responses to the next pandemic. Instead, those politicians have attacked the inquiry and rejected its scrutiny. There has been a chorus of denial that the public would expect them to have done anything differently. Any suggestion that there was any other way other than to let their friends and associates get to the front of the queue was branded wholly naive. Mr Hancock accused the inquiry of being hostile. Lord Agnew used even more choice language and used exasperated examples of known crooks saving Britain in the past. Mr Gove even went as far to say that it was a required aspect of a democratic accountability for politicians to refer and chase offers. But it's important to remember that not all these referrers were democratically elected. Many were unelected peers appointed by the ruling party and able to wield their influence within government. Lord Chadlington and his referral of SG Recruitment, and Baroness Mohn and her involvement in PPE MedPro are just two examples. This is not ministers acting within their specialist portfolio, checking that all was being done by civil servants on their policy area. This was ministers and politically exposed people with no expertise in procurement, or worse, politicians who are likely to directly benefit from the award of contracts, applying undue pressure to those processing offers within the VIP lane. In our opening submissions, we focused on the referral of SG Recruitment, one which came to Lord Feldman, a former Conservative Party chairman, from Lord Chadlington, another Conservative Party peer. It must have been obvious to Lord Feldman from the emails that the inquiry has shown to him that Lord Chadlington could benefit financially from any government contracts. Lord Feldman triaged the referral and spoke to David Sumner of SG Recruitment. He thought he was a, quote, good chap, and admitted that he had a, quote, soft spot for someone who was ex-military and ex-SAS and credentialised themselves in that way. This was a recruitment company with no experience of manufacturing PPE and with a pre-pandemic turnover of under £500,000 that was then processed by the VIP lane and was ultimately awarded 2 contracts collectively worth just under £50 million. SG Recruitment is reported to have made £1.1 million profit from those contracts. It is likely from the written material recently disclosed by the inquiry to core participants that the inquiry could conclude that both Mr Sumner and Lord Chadlington had the intention of using government contracts as a stepping stone to expanding their business and thereby increasing their personal financial benefit. This profiteering was enabled by the VIP lane and its prioritisation of offers based on who was making the referral and whether it was therefore a, quote, trusted offer. As we set out in the preliminary hearing to this module, we've always maintained that this inquiry needs to investigate relevant contracts from offer through to conclusion. This would have involved hearing from those who are processing the offers in the VIP lane, such as that from SG Recruitment, at every stage. In fact, the inquiry hasn't heard any evidence from those conducting the due diligence checks, the closing team, or anyone within the technical assurance team. The effect of this is that each of the witnesses the inquiry has heard from has been able to say that they expected someone else to have ensured that all the necessary checks were done. My lady, it is clear that the VIP lane did have real advantages to those who had their offers processed by it. Professor Sanchez-Greals explained that the emergency procurement should be, by nature, a time-limited procurement exercise, as it's only ever going to be a limited number of emergency contracts in a window before you go back to business as usual. Therefore, it matters who gets there first. There are no prizes for second place. Dr. Hall accepted that a VIP lane offer probably got to technical assurance quicker, and Lord Dighton confirmed that VIP lane offers had access to, quote, hand-holding to support them to navigate the workings of government. Mr James said in his written evidence that he thought the VIP offers had a designated contact in the technical assurance team, unlike the non-VIP lane. This, my lady, conferred 2 benefits. First, the VIP lane team could ask for the highest priority offers to be processed more swiftly by the technical assurance, even than other VIP lane offers. Ms Mathias referred to the existence of VVIPs. These were the very, very important people, suppliers who have contacted them directly via an MP, Lord, Lady, PM, private office, and those which the Cabinet Office are keen that they had a speedy response. Second, they could find out the reasons for rejection and feed them back to the supplier, which had the benefit of them being able to improve their product and continue the negotiations. In addition, Mr Young told the inquiry that within the VIP lane contracts that would normally have had weeks of due diligence went through a much shorter process, the benchmark of which was whether it was subjectively proportionate, taking into consideration the urgency of the need, given the lack of preparedness, the risk appetite set by the government, and the incredible pressure of the noise the processing team was subject to whilst desperately trying to secure PPE. No doubt as a result of all these processes, the conversion rates of the VIP lane were significantly higher. Mr Maran's evidence was that 11.86% of VIP lane offers were awarded contracts, compared to 1.13% of non-VIP offers. Importantly, Sir Chris Wormold, then the most senior civil servant within the DHSC and the principal accounting officer, acknowledged that too great an emphasis was placed on who made the referral as opposed to the nature and the promise of the lead. He said the problem was not with the differing standards of assessment, but who got to the front of the queue. And as a result, some less promising leads were given too great a priority. As Professor Sanchez-Grayals concluded, the VIP lane was an affront to good procurement. Mr Gove, Mr Hancock and other politicians have sought to undermine his evidence, but they can't get around the criticisms in his evidence. He is a preeminent expert. So they've resorted to personal diatribes, accusing him of a flawed analysis without providing the inquiry with any proper legal or academic challenge to his findings. The inquiry should be concerned about this approach and what it says about a culture of learning within government. We endorse Professor Sanchez-Grayals' view that the fact that all this time later, those involved don't recognise that billions of pounds were spent unlawfully speaks of a dysfunctional culture of lesson learning. It's also now well known that 50% of the companies channelled down the VIP lane provided PPE that was not fit for purpose. And the inquiry has not heard from a single witness or a single supplier to answer to this waste of money and resources. Overall, the government's inadequate preparedness and inefficient procurement systems resulted in a £3.8 billion of wasted PPE that could not be used in the NHS. My lady, by way of conclusion, good governance matters. Standards matter. Transparency matters. Better procurement means that governments can spend their money faster and better in times of emergency. As the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition said in their witness statement, the problems associated with the UK's emergency response are more than just procurement missteps and reflect something wider. The recent decline in good governance and political standards. The story of the pandemic requires us to reflect on the conduct of ministers, members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords, special advisers, political donors and other actors. My lady, those I represent are not a small group of people being whipped up into believing a politically motivated conspiracy theory, as Lord Agnew suggested. The public did, as Mr Gove and Lord Bethell both identified, have an expectation that the government would rapidly source and supply sufficient and safe PPE. But the public also expected its government to secure adequate amounts of appropriate PPE to protect our diverse health and social care and public sector, and to protect the already stretched public purse from fraud, profiteering and cronyism. My lady, your inquiry should be clear in its findings about the failings of the UK's pandemic procurement. After 4 weeks of evidence at further public expense to public funds, it cannot shy away from making criticisms of the VIP lane and those who profited from it. We also urge you to make clear recommendations for the future that insist on a foundation of good data, good governance, ethical practices and transparency. The public and the bereaved families expect no less.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Morris. I'm extremely grateful. Ms Campbell, I think you're up next.
Thank you, my lady. The UK and devolved entities were not ready. Procurement provision and supply chains were not set up to enable effective responses to the pandemic. Inventory management systems did not exist or were not up to the task. Stockpiles were out of date or wholly insufficient. Coordination across the UK and the devolved administrations was, as ever, on the hoof, superficial and the source of frustration. Response plans, certainly at the UK level, appear to have been drawn up in a panic and put into action by a small army of individuals operating, as you have observed this morning, from back bedrooms, on laptops, armed with Excel spreadsheets and their mobile phones, and ultimately working within a process that was more focused on triaging people than product, a system that was, giving it perhaps a most generous interpretation, ripe to be hijacked by shysters and fraudsters and operating at huge financial, political and human cost that will be felt for generations to come. While we did not agree with all of Lord Agnew's evidence, he is right when he says that a huge debt legacy has been left to our children's generation who will have to struggle to pay it off. The expression, "it was worse than a crime, it was a mistake," comes to mind. Except it wasn't just one mistake. The mistakes were systemic and prolonged and enduring. And when it comes to the bereaved families, their children will pay not just a financial debt, but many will carry a huge emotional one. My lady, it has not escaped the notice of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved, nor will it have escaped your notice, we suspect, that for several witnesses the answers to many questions in this module has been more combative, more dismissive, even more evasive than in previous modules. You have heard staunch defences suggesting the VIP lane was necessary, and it was naive to think otherwise, that should the need or opportunity arise in future, it would or even should be recreated. Perhaps the rationale for that defensiveness comes from having established a deeply flawed system rather than inherited one, as may have been the get-out in previous modules. But whatever the ex post facto justification, the reality is a system of triage for so-called VIPs was not necessary. It was not something followed by the devolved administrations nor in other nations. The problems faced in London were not unique. Shamefully, the response to them was. What was necessary was a proper, transparent and decisive triage system. Note the evidence of Karen Bailey yesterday. BSO PALS in Belfast received over 2,000 offers which, following triage and removing duplication, were distilled into about 45 useful leads. Some were referred by politicians, some apparently commended by the CMO, but all went through the triage system on a first-come, first-served basis, save for FFP3 masks, which were triaged separately given the urgent need. Contrast this with the evidence of Chris Young from the Department of Health and Social Care. In London, they got something in the region of 50,000 offers from 15,000 suppliers. In terms of comparative population size, that would suggest that the BSO in Belfast received proportionately more offers, or at least a comparable number of offers, as the Department of Health and Social Care. 50,000 is, of course, a large number, but for many of those offers, the plums and the duff could have been easily separated on the evidence you have heard. Offers of nutritional advice and knitted goods into one category, offers of substantial quantities of PPE and equipment in the other. The PPE buy-sell, we know, grew rapidly to a team of 500 people. 50,000 offers and 15,000 suppliers amongst 500 is 100 offers per person, or 30 suppliers. Now, of course, that calculation is crude, and it was not that easy, but neither did it have to be so difficult. You have been given, my lady, no cogent reason why there could not have been a system of triage to consider relevant factors that were said to influence the special treatment afforded to some, such as a background in invention, access to factories which could enable large-scale production, an assessment based on the viability of the lead and not the political weight of the referee or the political connections of the offeror. My lady, a glaring problem with the VIP lane is that it should have been clear at the time of establishing it that a two-tier system based on political connections or cronyism was wrong. But those making that decision did not, or could not, or will not see that. But perhaps the most glaring problem is that the VIP lane was not even successful, the consequences of which are felt and continue to be felt by those from whom you have heard, those who worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week to try to make it work, the frontline staff who lacked necessary PPE, from whom you heard in Module 3, and whose evidence was revisited in this module through the Royal College of Nursing and others, and the bereaved families who willed things to be different at the time of the pandemic and still wish it to be different today. These people are not, as Lord Agnew appeared to suggest, whipped up by false narratives or headlines of a heinous plan by those in power to enrich themselves or their mates. Theirs is a legitimate and deep-seated anger born out of the failings that they have witnessed and the loss they have experienced as a result. But it is also an anger at the political failure to prepare and the establishment of a system that enabled profiteering and cronyism while Rome burned. And why shouldn't they be angry? The evidence that you have heard in this module does a disservice to the UK, to those who did their best within a rotten system, and to those who died and carry on in grief. But, my lady, it also does a disservice to future generations, not only because they will have to pay for it, But as witnessed by this module, the time spent unpacking and unpicking the controversy of the VIP lane is time that would have been better spent asking questions and learning lessons from all the other issues within the list of issues for this module, but in relation to which there has been insufficient time to at least publicly consider them. What is the role of technology, of AI, of automation in future procurement? Do we have sufficient skills, expertise and experience and training to deal with future crises? What PPE might we need in a future pandemic, and what ongoing efforts are being made to look at alternative approaches such as reusable PPE? How can we diversify our sources of supply domestically and internationally to avoid vulnerabilities in a manufacturing system being concentrated in one part of the world? How do we mitigate against forced labour, child labour, human trafficking, modern slavery, and the other unethical treatment in our supply chains? How do we meet future demands whilst also adhering as far as possible to our environmental obligations and considering the climate crisis? Previously, the focus on procurement has been on securing items at lowest cost, but at the expense of everything else, people, environment and resilience. That was the case across the board in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but it cannot justifiably be the case in future. These are all issues within your list of issues for this module. But given the public interest and the significant public interest in the aspects of the VIP lane, there has been insufficient time for proper public scrutiny. You will understand that I mean no criticism of you, my lady, when I observe that with reference to some of the filibustering in the evidence that you have heard, future generations deserved better from this module. The UK government and senior civil service would do well to acknowledge its own mistakes and to seek to learn from others, and not just to politely entertain and then dust off criticism, but to really listen and to really learn. And on this, as it happens, they could look to their colleagues in the devolved administrations, where systems, though far from perfect, were almost certainly better. It is striking that whatever other faults may be identified, Northern Ireland, like the other devolved administrations, appear to have avoided conflicts of interest and controversies that haunted England. One reason might be found in the concept of democratic accountability, a concept which appears to have different meanings in different jurisdictions. To Mr. Gove, democratic accountability is boldly advanced as a defence for the VIP lane, leading quite remarkably to a rejection of the idea that civil servants should be protected from undue ministerial pressure. In Scotland, according to Ms. Freeman, democratic accountability acts in part as a defence from the consequences of the VIP lane, over which Scottish ministers had no say and with which they disagreed. It'll perhaps come as no surprise that we endorse the evidence of Ms. Freeman. Local democratic accountability for procurement is important because of the difficult or invidious positions into which devolved actors would be placed, where an issue is devolved, but decisions are taken by Westminster. Of course, there should be cooperation, exchange of data, exchange of approaches, and a mutual aid agreement. But it will be important, whatever the recommendations the inquiry makes in this module, that the system of devolved democratic accountability for devolved issues remains. And as to the Northern Ireland procurement response, we highlight some aspects of the evidence recently heard. The evidence of Tim Lusty describing procurement from CR Pharmaceuticals, making it clear that his role was not part of some master plan, though neither was it just the luck of the Irish. There was an element of good fortune that the executive had opened an office in the one country which could supply PPE, enabling the role of Mr. Lusty to be occupied more out of circumstance and opportunity than design. But there was also evidence of working hard to seize the moment, enabling an individual from a small country to secure a multi-million-pound deal on a global stage. For reasons addressed in the Northern Ireland Audit Office report, to which we will return more fully in writing, the process was not as transparent as it might have been, but it does appear to have been successful. However, my lady, and it is a significant point, This is not a plan for what to do in a future pandemic, because those pieces may not move so fortuitously into place. And if it's not a plan for a future pandemic, what is the plan? Conversely, the proposed joint procurement with the Republic of Ireland fell apart just shortly before the CR Pharmaceuticals deal, perhaps demonstrating that Northern Ireland was too late to fully appreciate its position both within these islands and on the world stage, and therefore too late to respond. And so although the industry of BSO PALs and others in the North deserves due recognition, once again I have to address you on pervasive issues in Northern Ireland. A failure to recognise and remedy gaps in available data, you've heard that, my lady, before. A lack of self-reflection and internal learning. No review of lessons learned by BSO PALs. A wholly insufficient lessons learned document looked at very briefly yesterday from the Department of Finance. And I perhaps rather boldly anticipate we may yet hear a departmental pat on the back from the Department of Health. Complacency or self-congratulation is unwarranted, and our concerns at the lack of self-reflection are not merely theoretical, because the evidence received in this module raises significant concerns which have not yet received the consideration internally in Northern Ireland that they deserve. By way of example, whilst very significant amounts of PPE may have been obtained, there is ample evidence of failures to ensure the right equipment making its way speedily to the appropriate end user. The most glaring failure was the delay in ensuring private care home staff and residents would have access to PPE, an essential issue for ensuring protection of the most vulnerable and preventing the spread of the virus. The written evidence indicates that Northern Ireland paid more for equivalent PPE than other devolved nations and had PPE of greater value written off as compared to other jurisdictions. Such failings should not simply be dismissed. The loss of financial resources in an already underfunded healthcare system is measured in loss of care and ultimately in loss of life. The lack of evidence of conflict of interest in the jurisdiction must be seen against the inadequacy of safeguards imposed to protect against such conflicts. It relied exclusively on relevant officials self-declaring conflicts, with obvious difficulties in detecting those that may have been undisclosed. And, my lady, the problems with modelling were never resolved and it appears have yet to be resolved. Worse still, the Public Health Agency, the very devolved entity with responsibility for this issue, barely addresses this in their statement to this module, reinforcing our repeated concerns at the lack of self-examination and heightening the concern that such fundamental errors would simply be repeated in any future pandemic. At the end of yesterday, my lady, we heard evidence that reminded us of the global upheaval in the last 5 years. It's not just been the pandemic or measured in pandemic terms, but politically, geographically, and environmentally, we are in an uncertain world. There are many future challenges to be faced, and there is no room for stagnation. The Northern Ireland COVID bereaved stress that we cannot just hope for the best and see what happens. And the recommendations from this module of your inquiry must enable us to prepare for the worst, while of course, as always, hoping that does not come to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Campbell. I'm very grateful. Ms Parsons, I think you're next to go.
Thank you, my lady. I make these closing submissions on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved families for Justice Cymru. 5 years ago, almost to the day, Wales reported one of its first deaths from a hospital-acquired COVID infection. Douglas Miles was admitted to the Holywell Community Hospital in Denbigh for an operation. He caught COVID whilst in hospital and tragically on the 29th of March 2020 passed away. His daughter, Sylvia Parry, said this: "There was no PPE at the time and my father was just a sitting duck in the hospital." She observed undertakers there in full hazmat suits while healthcare workers, reliant on supplies from local health boards, had nothing. It would prove to be one of the first of many deaths in Wales from nosocomial infection. And it is a story to which many in the group will relate. Many of them question why the Welsh Government was so slow to react. Many of them question why the staff and patients and residents were unable to take precautions necessary to curb the spread of the virus. They believe that the reason why Wales has the highest rate of nosocomial deaths must have been due in part to the lack of PPE or appropriate PPE and equipment, resulting in mass cluster outbreaks in wards and care homes across Wales. I turn to some specific concerns raised in this module. First, pandemic stockpiles. Despite pandemic influenza preparedness programme being a UK-wide programme, it was the Welsh Government who were responsible for procuring the pandemic stockpile, for ensuring stock was kept in date and ready for use. The Welsh Government failed to do this. What was the nature and extent of the failure? The critical failure relates to a critical piece of PPE, FFP3 masks. Of all FFP3 masks held in Wales as at the 6th of February 2020, over 90% were out of date. By the 12th of March 2020, a Department for Health and Social Care email records that Wales is in the most challenging position of all the 4 nations, being down to just 10,000 FFP3 masks. Whilst Mr Irvine suggested stock may have been retested within days, released on the 25th of March 2020, the same cannot be said for the entirety of the stock, which the Welsh Government itself estimated would take anywhere between 4 to 16 weeks to retest. We also know that in the scramble to retest, 50% of the retest did not pass the face fit test, largely because they did not fit women, 70% of the health and social care workforce. And it was not just FFP3 masks. Surgical gowns, for example, were not in stock. 0 in the stockpile, despite a target of over 500,000. What were the reasons for the failure? Why did the Welsh Government not even have that which it was required to have as a result of the PIP strategy? Mr Irvine could not assist you. It was not that the Welsh Government were unaware. There were regular stock reviews carried out with Welsh Government officials themselves. I'm not trying to be evasive, he said. That would be a matter for the Welsh Government to answer. The Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru group observes that the Welsh Government have not answered that question. Notwithstanding witness statements totalling hundreds of pages and notwithstanding thousands of exhibits, the answer remains elusive. Second, distribution and logistics. As we have heard repeatedly from the Welsh Government, Wales never ran out of PPE at a national level. But, my lady, such a claim is artificial when those monitoring and distributing the stock, that's shared services, were also the ones managing requests for PPE and determining what percentage of the request would be supplied. Mr Irvine may not have liked the term demand management, but that is the very process he described to you. But regardless, even if Wales did not run out of PPE, that is of little comfort to those who experienced such shortages at a local level. What good is a long-sleeved gown and FFP3 mask in a warehouse in Denbigh when it is needed at the local hospital, where COVID is spreading through the ward among staff and patients alike? That brings logistics and distribution of PPE into focus. Mr Slade suggested to you, my lady, that problems in supply and distribution related to the provision of information about what was needed and where, and what stocks were held at a local level. There was, apparently, no system of knowing how much stock hospitals had. They were starting from scratch. So it was about having better flows of information and intelligence. Mr Brace suggested confusion was caused by IPC guidance, leading to tensions in staff understanding what was required and therefore what was to be supplied. A red herring, the group says, given there was just one change in guidance that affected mask wearing. But, like Mr Slade, he suggested that there were also problems with information flows. He said there were coordination issues at the hospital end about what stock was held and where. So the stock was there, but healthcare workers just didn't know it. Such explanations, my lady, raise more questions than provide answers. Shared services had been supplying PPE to health boards and hospitals for the best part of a decade when the pandemic started. Distribution paths and delivery points must have been well established. Why had not even the most basic stock management system been put in place? And if the explanation is correct, that there was plenty of stock floating around the NHS estate in Wales, why did the problem go unattended or unsolved? Whilst the Welsh Government may have felt confident and assured they had a grip on the situation, by April-May 2020, this was evidently not the case. Healthcare workers and members of the group alike witnessed shortages throughout 2020 and into 2021. The reasons for supply and distribution failures are far from clear, and as such, there can be no confidence or assurance that lessons will have been learnt for the future. Third, care homes. Here again, the inquiry has heard that, like the healthcare system, the social care system in Wales never ran out of stock. If that's right, again, the position offers little comfort to those who saw staff and residents in care homes unprotected, lacking vital PPE, oxygen, testing and so on. The group believe many died unnecessarily, avoidably, in COVID outbreaks in care homes in Wales as a result. One key issue is the issue of delay. The Welsh Government took until the 19th of March 2020 to expand shared services remit to the care sector. Thereafter, supply was patchy at best. Some care homes had sufficient PPE, others did not. By May 2020, only 2/3 had their PPE needs met by shared services. As to when the position stabilised, the Welsh Local Government Association suggests it was not until September 2020 when a service level agreement was reached. Care Forum Wales suggests later, November 2020, when it understood a new stock management system had been introduced. Mr. Slade did not accept that care homes had been overlooked while the NHS was prioritised, nor did he accept that the Welsh Government could and should have acted more quickly to assist care homes. But the recognition by both himself and Mr. Brace that in a future pandemic, shared services must provide PPE immediately for the care sector tells you that the response to supplying PPE to care homes in Wales was too slow. A second key issue is distribution. We know that in theory, shared services supplied PPE to joint equipment stores for onward distribution to the care sector by local authorities. We know that in practice, this process failed. Mr. Irvine said, and I quote, "There was more than enough PPE in the joint equipment stores, but the joint equipment stores or local authorities more generally weren't necessarily aware of what was actually there." The suggestion is hard to understand. It seems to be being suggested that care homes desperately in need of PPE could have had what they wanted, indeed could have had more than what they wanted, if only they'd checked their local joint equipment store. The suggestion is also hard to understand given Stockwatch, shared services inventory management system, was completely unfit for purpose and left shared services, as Mr. Irvine himself put it, unable to understand if we were fulfilling their requirements and with gaps in how much stock areas actually required. If my lady were to accept that joint equipment stores were indeed full to overflowing, that would be by luck rather than design. I say if, my lady, because of course, the inquiry has not heard from the local authorities and care home providers. It might be that they would have provided an explanation to counter the implicit suggestion that distribution failures lay with them. Fourthly, infection prevention and control guidance on FFP3 masks. I've already mentioned the deficiencies in Wales FFP3 stock, as noted on the 12th of March 2020. It was on the 13th of March 2020, one day later, that IPC guidance was amended such that FFP3 masks were to be used only in intensive care units or in aerosol-generating procedures. While the group is aware the IPC guidance was considered in a previous module, the group urges the inquiry to address the issue afresh in the context of the cross-cutting issue of adequacy of PPE supply. Professor Catherine Noakes, from whom the inquiry has already heard, explained the reluctance to properly acknowledge airborne transmission, was in part because of the significant resource and operational implications of doing so. If supply issues shaped the IPC guidance, as many in the group fear, then the impacts of lessons learned about PPE supply chains and distributions will be reduced. What matters is not simply having PPE, but appropriate PPE with the appropriate level of protection. Lastly, ventilators and equipment. My lady, the Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru's concerns in this module have not been confined to PPE. Its members also experienced shortcomings and failures in access to ventilators and other key pieces of equipment. We have heard evidence that much of the procurement activities for ventilators took place on a UK-wide basis. Little attention has been given to what happened in Wales. Consistent with the Welsh Government's general narrative for PPE, it has of course stated that Wales was never short of ventilators. The members of the group have good reason to doubt such claims. The members experienced those shortages, problems in access firsthand, and there has been no scrutiny as to the reason why. In conclusion, my lady, just 4 witnesses have given evidence from Wales. Much of their evidence was dedicated to the technical and procedural aspects of procurement. But for the members of the Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru, the concern has always been to understand why those that needed PPE and equipment, such as ventilators and CPAPs, didn't have it. In opening, the group asked why there were such shortages of PPE, why access to ventilators and equipment was inadequate, why the risk of nosocomial infection was so high in Wales, why care homes were overlooked, whether shortages in supply of FFP3 masks influenced guidance, such that healthcare workers were inadequately protected. These questions, my lady, regrettably remain unanswered. Gaps remain. Areas of the Welsh Government's conduct in respect of PPE and key equipment remains unscrutinised. And the point is an important one. If gaps remain, if questions remain unanswered, there is, of course, a real risk, my lady, that the Welsh Government have not learnt lessons for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Parsons. Ms Mitchell, I think your turn.
My lady, the Scottish COVID Bereaved came into this module with concerns doubtlessly shared by many that the governments in the UK had failed to ensure that those working for the NHS, staffing nursing homes and care homes, the ill and the dying and their families were provided with the PPE supplies that they needed timelessly to face the pandemic. What the bereaved have heard over the course of this module shows that their concerns were wholly legitimate. The bereaved wish to acknowledge, however, the hard work and dedication of a great many public servants who are trying their best to ensure that those most in need could be provided with PPE that they so desperately needed. While the beginning of the pandemic signalled for many throughout the country a slowdown or stop of the regular rhythm of the working week, there were those who were going above and beyond the call of duty to try and make sure that people whom they had never met and would never meet were protected from the worst of the pandemic. The personal and professional toll that this took on them has been obvious to the Scottish COVID bereaved, and they wish to thank them for their efforts. The bereaved will provide the inquiry with detailed written submissions in due course. Those submissions will seek to assist the Chair in reaching her conclusions, while the bereaved will seek to be as constructive as possible and provide recommendations on how we can be better prepared and better equipped, in every sense of the word, to face the pandemic. They will not shy away from making what they see as deserved criticism. Many of the recommendations will now be familiar from the inquiry's other modules. They need to be better prepared for the next pandemic, the need for stockpiling, the importance of domestic production capability, the importance of data. There will also be recommendations unique to this module, highlighting the importance of fairness and transparency, of having robust processes in place to guard against possible conflicts of interest or corruption, the need for fully integrated systems, the importance of centralised procurement processes, and the need to ensure that PPE and other equipment is not only supplied to NHS settings, but also to ensure that care and nursing homes are properly considered. The vast sums spent by the UK Government and devolved administrations between January 2020 and June 2022 would have been unimaginable for governments to spend on PPE and medical supplies were it not for the pandemic. It was essential that the spending was carried out properly, that there were, where possible, necessary checks and balances put in place, and that the public were able to obtain the best possible deal. The public, of course, were well aware of the worldwide scramble for PPE, and as the pandemic spread across the globe and healthcare systems, that people were being swamped. The bereaved are also aware that human nature being what it is, there will always be those who seek to unjustifiably profit in moments of national crisis. There were undoubtedly those who saw offers of PPE, whether real or imagined, as being a way to line their own pockets. While those who sought to profiteer may measure their profits in pounds and pence, our losses have ultimately been measured in lives. Mr Gove, both in his witness statement and evidence to the inquiry, was dismissive of those who questioned the UK Government's approach to procurement during the pandemic. Mr Hancock's equally dismissive evidence and at times hostile manner was noted. The Scottish COVID bereaved do not share Mr Gove's Nixonian belief that criticisms of the UK Government were unjustified and politically motivated, nor do they consider Mr Hancock's personal opinions on the work of the inquiry to be of assistance. Rather, the evidence before this inquiry has led the bereaved to consider that however bad they may have thought the procurement situation had been, the reality was worse. It was the government's responsibility to protect against profiteering and corruption and to ensure that public money was being properly spent on the most vital equipment. Not only did it fail to protect us in this way, it created a system obviously vulnerable to corruption. Times of crisis are not times for the old boys and girls network. Proper expertise was required. There was no equivalent to the VIP lane anywhere in the world. The approach taken by the UK Government meant that valuable time and resources were spent triaging people rather than offers. The approach taken by the UK Government upended the normal rules of public procurement. Basic approaches and safeguards were not taken. A proper triage system for a swamped system was required, and that is not the focus of criticism. It is the creation of a priority lane for offers referred by politically exposed people, which bred the risk of corruption. Indeed, even if all had been examined by this inquiry and had been above board, the failure of itself was the creation of a system with that risk. As with justice, which must not only be done but be seen to be done, any system of triage ought not only to have been fair, but should have been transparently so. Module 5, of course, was not solely focused on the VIP lane. The bereaved, in their written submissions, will have more to say on the ventilator challenge, of the relationship between the UK and Scottish governments and how that impacted upon procurement, and the role of NHS, NSS, and what can be learned and what improvements can be made to that. The bereaved will also supply submissions in relation to the evidence heard during closed sessions. They look forward to your leadership's recommendations to help ensure that, when the next pandemic comes, public money is properly spent and those on the front line, the sick and their relatives, are able to get the necessary PPE and medical equipment to allow them to face the challenges of the pandemic. These are the submissions on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. Very grateful. I think we can get Mr Thomas and probably Ms Monaghan in before lunch. Mr Thomas.
My lady, we're at a juncture of reflection and action and it's crucial to acknowledge the profound responsibility that this inquiry bears. We've delved deep into the heart of the procurement systems during the most significant global health crisis of our time, uncovering not just inefficiencies but profound injustices. These injustices have disproportionately affected those who are already at the margins, our ethnic minority healthcare workers, who have faced not only the front lines of a pandemic, but also the system failures of the system meant to protect them. A question that you have probably asked yourself many times during this module, and one that you will undoubtedly weigh when you deliberate, is, did it need to be this way? Yes, there was a global pandemic, and throughout this module, Milady, if I may say so, you have been very mindful of that, recognising the difficulties faced by many of the witnesses, offering praise where it was due, and showing kindness. However, while it is possible to sympathise with those in charge of procurement, can we really excuse the failings that we have heard? Absolutely not. You see, the urgency of a crisis does not diminish the need for equity. Rather, it highlights and amplifies it. Every decision that deprioritised the public sector equality duty not only undermined legal mandates, but also compromised the very lives it sought to protect. As we move forward, it's imperative that this inquiry not only acknowledges these failings, but also acts decisively to ensure that they're not repeated, not only as optional extras, but as indispensable pillars of procurement to safeguard against the magnification of risk to our most vulnerable healthcare workers during future pandemics or crises. You see, throughout this inquiry, we've heard testimony after testimony, each paint a stark picture of a procurement process fraught with lapses in inclusivity and transparency. Milady, I'm sure you'll recall Sir Christopher Wormold's evidence in Module 1, which confirmed DHSC had stocked lower levels of PPE, specifically respirators, suitable for ethnic minority staff, and that little planning had been done to consider the equality of PPE provisions. You will also no doubt recall the powerful evidence heard throughout Module 3 about the human impact and harm caused by inadequate PPE supplies and racial bias in key equipment such as the pulse oximeters. I do not intend to repeat or spend a lot of time repeating or rehearsing this evidence, but we trust you will have it in mind when reflecting on the process evidence that we've heard over the past month. We ask you in particular to remember the powerful evidence of Professor J.S. Bamra, who contributed on behalf of FEMHO, quote, "The consistent picture from across our members was one of discrimination through unavailability or inadequate PPE and fit testing rejection. Our members were routinely expected to go on high-risk clinical areas without adequate PPE, if any at all. Many of our members felt they were pressured into this and did not have a discretion to refuse. Even some pregnant nurses were threatened with disciplinaries if they refused. These are not mere procedural failings. They are breaches of trust, breaches that have placed undue risk on the lives of those dedicated to saving others. From the evidence presented, it's clear that the public sector equality duty, a cornerstone of our legal framework, was often sidelined in a frantic rush to secure supplies, leaving behind a trail of consequences that we are only now beginning to fully understand. But it's not enough to merely identify these failings. As representatives of FEMHO, we are here to not just critique, but to catalyst change. I've said it time and time again, FEMHO wishes to be solution-orientated and future-looking. FEMHO wants a procurement system that not only learns from past mistakes, but one that actively paves the way for an equitable healthcare system. A system where safety and the needs of every healthcare worker, irrespective of their ethnic background, are not just considered, but are central to the procurement strategies that protect them. Let me now turn to the evidence that we've heard. In our initial week of testimonies, we delved deeply into the structural shortcomings of the pandemic response, particularly focusing on PPE, procurement process. As Professor Sanchez Grauls, a preeminent expert in procurement law, offered a damning critique of the government's approach, he pointed out that the pursuit of speed over due diligence led to a disregarding of the foundational principles of public procurement. Transparency was not merely sidelined, it was disregarded, creating a fertile ground for mismanagement and potential malpractice. His testimony highlighted the need for a balanced approach that does not compromise essential transparency and accountability in times of crisis. Additionally, the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition outlined how the deviations from standard procurement practices not only increased the risk of corruption, but also diminished the quality and suitability of supplies procured. The coalition argued for a return to a more stringent procurement regulations, emphasising the need for robust procurement laws is not just about restoring normalcy, it's about reinforcing the integrity of our entire healthcare system against future shocks. The evidence presented by these experts brings to light significant flaws in the system, flaws that had direct consequences on the ground. For instance, it was revealed through witness testimonies that the lack of proper vetting and the hasty engagement with new suppliers led to numerous instances where PPE was either ineffective or wholly unsuitable. This not only endangered healthcare workers, but also wasted valuable resources at a critical time. Moreover, discussions during the first week also touched on the psychological impact on healthcare professionals, the uncertainty regarding the effectiveness of PPE they were provided added unnecessary stress to an already overwhelming situation. As one frontline worker's testimony was shared, every day we were unsure if our equipment would protect us or if it would fail, exposing us to a deadly virus. This palpable fear underscores the tangible human costs of the procurement failures. As we delve into the systemic failings in our healthcare procurement processes, it's crucial to acknowledge not only the impact on our members, but also on the patients they serve and the families affected by these shortcomings. The emotional trauma and grief borne by families who lost loved ones due to inadequate protective measures are profound and must be addressed. This is not about playing politics. It's about recognising the full human cost of our shortcomings, ensuring that our advocacy speaks to and for the broader community affected by these issues. The need for action is clear and urgent. The testimony from the first week compels us to critically re-evaluate the procurement systems to ensure that they encompass enforceable safeguards that protect all participants in the healthcare system, particularly ethnic minority workers who were disproportionately affected. These workers often face the dual challenge of being more likely to contract the virus and more likely to receive inadequate protection due to the one-size-fits-all approach in PPE procurement. It was alarming to our members that Max Kainduff demonstrated an ignorance of the issue even today, saying, and I quote, "The PPE is itself, I think, I may be wrong, relatively agnostic. A mask is a mask." The second week of testimony shed light on some of the most contentious aspects of the government's pandemic response, particularly through the examination of the VIP lane operation. We heard from high-profile figures, Michael Gove, Lord Fellman, whose involvement in this VIP lane raised critical questions about transparency and fairness of the procurement process. Amidst this backdrop of urgency and exception, we heard poignant testimonies from Andrew Mitchell and Emily Lawson, which brought to the forefront the human impact of those procurement strategies. Andrew Mitchell, reflecting on the strategic risks identified during the pandemic, acknowledged that there was a failure to provide inclusive product specifications. He specifically noted that the standard PPE provided often did not cater adequately to the diverse needs of all healthcare workers, particularly those from ethnic minority backgrounds, who reported significant issues with the fit of protective equipment. Emily Lawson's testimony complemented this view by pointing out to the reactive nature of the adjustments made to accommodate these needs. She referred to efforts to rectify the oversights as the pandemic progressed, but was vague on the detail and conceded that initially the systems were not designed to handle diversity of needs, which resulted in preventable exposure to risks for some of our most vulnerable healthcare workers. Dame Emily's evidence is particularly crucial as it underscores a significant shift needed within our healthcare systems from reactive to proactive inclusivity. The insights from these sessions paints a clear picture of procurement systems caught off guard, not just by the virus, but by its own operational blind spots. My lady, these discussions are not merely academic, they have real-world implications. They tell us that the systems fail to consider the diverse needs of the users. The consequences can be dire. My lady, I'm going to move on because I know time is short and I want to come to my conclusions. So let me conclude. It's clear that the inquiry has uncovered not just systemic failings, but also a pathway to substantive reform. The evidence compels us to act, not out of obligation, but out of necessity, to address the disparities that have come to light. Public sector duty compliance. There were persistent issues in complying with the public sector equality duty that has revealed significant gaps in our procurement practices. Inclusivity in PPE design. The one-size-fits-all approach failed many in our diverse healthcare workforce. The engagement and representation. The testimony has also highlighted the need for greater representation and involvement of groups like FEMHO in the decision-making process. Jonathan Moran admitted that this is an area where we can do a much better job. As Rosemary Gallagher noted, within PPE procurement teams, the clinical voice was completely absent. This inevitably had a knock-on effect on the distribution, as without clear insights and data on the needs of local forces, decision makers lacked valuable information. Transparency and accountability. The lack of transparency and accountability in the procurement process has eroded trust and compromised the effectiveness of healthcare response. Learning and improvement for future preparedness. There is a clear consensus, milady, on the need to integrate the lessons learned from the pandemic into future emergency preparedness policies. This includes ensuring that a reliable supply of appropriate PPE, fitting PPE, and developing responsive systems that can adapt quickly to feedback from and evolving needs during a crisis, and cultural and structural changes. Finally, the testimonies have underscored the necessity for cultural and structural changes within our healthcare procurement services. So, milady, as this inquiry moves to its recommendation phase, let us be guided by these insights. The urgency for change is evident and the path forward is clear. It's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that the lessons of this pandemic are real and lasting changes to protect and uphold the rights and safety of every healthcare worker, irrespective of their background. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. Very grateful. Ms. Moynihan, would you like to take us up to lunch?
Yes, my lady. My lady, I make this closing statement on behalf of the Department of Health of Northern Ireland. My lady, in assisting this inquiry, the Department has supplied a number of detailed witness statements. Just yesterday, the inquiry heard oral evidence from Chris Matthews, who was the Deputy Secretary of the Resource and Corporate Management Group. By this evidence, it's hoped that the Department has provided a comprehensive picture of the procurement processes in Northern Ireland and how those processes operated to secure key healthcare-related equipment and supplies during the pandemic. It should now also be apparent that in general terms, the items obtained, including their specification, quality and volume, were sufficient to meet the needs of the people of Northern Ireland, and that all relevant organisations worked together to ensure that these materials were effectively distributed to those who needed them. Now, my lady, the Department does not want to pat itself on the back or appear in any way self-congratulatory, as has been suggested earlier this morning, but objectively, we contend that the Department has demonstrated that in the relevant period, its public procurement processes met with the highest standards of integrity, transparency and good administration. At every juncture, the Department endeavoured to ensure that the expenditure of public funds was transparent, accountable and provided value for money to the maximum possible extent in all of the difficult and exigent circumstances. The Department would also like to take this opportunity, my lady, to clarify any confusion which may have arisen on foot of some of the questions posed to Ms Karen Bailey yesterday by Counsel for the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice. My lady will recall, of course, that Ms Bailey was questioned in relation to an email chain which was exchanged inter alia between BSO PALS, the then Minister for Health and the CMO. That email exchange is located at INQ 00050 3883. Regrettably, it appears that in joining two discrete issues in the one email, that the CMO's approval for a business case has been conflated as a specific approval, or as is put this morning, commendation of a firm called NWT Distribution and their supply proposal. My lady, we contend that is a misapprehension, as is evident from the fact that the company, NWT Distribution, offered 20,000 ventilators over 6 weeks. It is trite to say that Northern Ireland did not have the need, much less the capacity, for this amount of ventilators. The Department would also like to clarify 2 points arising from that email chain. The first point relates to the role that the CMO took in relation to procurement. The CMO, in his role as the chair of Gold Command, and as is apparent in that email chain, approved a business case, which was a legitimate part of his role, whereby he was required to authorise spending proposals related to a range of areas pertaining to the COVID response. That approval should not be confused with the CMO having had any direct or indeed active involvement in the process of procurement or any specific contract. The actual sourcing and procurement was a matter for BSO PALS. Therefore, we contend, my lady, that the CMO's statement to this module is accurate and he took no active involvement in the procurement process, including the means of procurement. The second point, my lady, to make relates to the erroneous view that the CMO had commended, or indeed, as was suggested yesterday, given approval for the specific contract proposal. The issue here relates to the NWT distribution proposal, and in considering part of the email in isolation, it appears to indicate that within a matter of several hours and without any due process or investigation, the CMO approved that proposal. However, on consideration of the entire email chain, it becomes clear, particularly when one considers the email written by Mr Liam McIver, who was Ms Bailey's predecessor in BSO PALS, that the approval from the CMO related only to spending on the specific business case which had been put to him. As I've stated previously, my lady, BSO PALS had sought that approval from the CMO in his role as Chair of Gold Command. This was distinct from the NWT proposal. Liam McIver's email demonstrates that in addition to acknowledging the CMO's approval, BSO PALS would separately actively explore the offer from NWT alongside that of another number of companies. Now, more generally, my lady, throughout the course of these hearing sessions, the Department has reflected on the evidence adduced and the issues that have emerged. The Department would like to highlight some points pertaining to its work at the time. And the first thing I would like to touch on is the issue of the provision and availability of PPE to the independent care sector. I should be clear by now, in Northern Ireland, BSO PALS is responsible for Northern Ireland's health and social care equipment supply chain and procurement activity on behalf of the trusts. Prior to the pandemic, the Department had no role in the provision of PPE for privately run residential and nursing homes. In fact, each independent healthcare provider procured their own PPE. The Department acknowledges that there were instances when concerns were raised by the independent healthcare providers about concerns regarding a lack of PPE being made available to them. However, the Department engaged with those healthcare providers, the trusts and the RQIA, and by early to mid-April 2020, these issues were resolved. The Department is also aware that there has been at times a perception that there was confusion around the messaging in relation to how the independent healthcare providers would procure PPE at the early stages of the pandemic. It is the Department's view that the interim guidance, which was developed and published early in the pandemic, was unequivocal in its clarity of messaging. That guidance clearly stated that if those independent providers were unable to source items of PPE, the trusts would work closely with them to ensure that appropriate equipment was made available. This message was reiterated and expanded on in later versions of the same guidance published in March, April and September of 2020. Moreover, the Department was in regular communication with representatives of the independent care sector to help ensure that the guidance drafted not only reflected their views, but was also understood by them. Indeed, the Department is further assured of the input that was provided to the independent care home sector, given that, in the early stages of the pandemic, there was a representative from their body who was fully involved in the BSO PALS structures. In that role, the independent care home sector had the opportunity to see it firsthand and so understand BSO PALS work on the provision of PPE at those very early stages of the pandemic. Again, my lady, and without wishing in any way to appear self-congratulatory, we say it is reasonable to assess that whilst playing a limited role in procurement, the Department took decisive and coordinated steps to address the PPE supply and distribution challenges that Northern Ireland faced, both in the early days of the pandemic and in preparation for subsequent waves. This included using its best endeavours to ensure that any surplus stock was fully utilised whenever possible. On another note, my lady, the experience of the pandemic has identified learning and prompted change which we have already put into effect, such as the dynamic purchasing system, which is still available for use today. In that regard, it is fair to say that the Department has benefited significantly from a number of reviews and lessons learned exercises. This morning does not permit sufficient time for me to provide a detailed list of all of the learning points and the implementation thereof, but if I may, I would briefly summarise some of the key areas of work which we have used to strengthen processes and improve resilience. The rapid review of COVID-19 PPE, commissioned by the then Minister for Health, identified learning points across a number of key areas, including the management of PPE, modelling, stock management, supply chain resilience, PIPP release mechanisms, and the appropriate support for staff. While some of those actions were implemented in a timely manner, others proved to be more challenging given their nature. That being said, all 17 actions that were associated with that action plan were fully implemented by the end of December 2020. Secondly, my lady, a Northern Ireland Audit Office review on the supply and procurement of PPE to local healthcare providers was published in March 2022. The Department and its arm's length bodies have all taken action in relation to relevant learning points arising from that report. Finally, and as was referred to in much more detail in the corporate statement, a review report identifying key themes and lessons learned from the content of emails received from the PPE mailbox was produced and also shared with the sector for consideration and appropriate action. Now, my lady, to conclude, the Department would like to place on record its appreciation of those staff involved in the substantial efforts made to procure and distribute PPE in Northern Ireland. While Northern Ireland, of course, faced logistical and geographical challenges, the Department commends the dedication and commitment of all of those who were involved in ensuring that PPE was secured and distributed effectively during the period of global supply chain pressure. The Department finally, my lady, reiterates that it remains committed to learning from all of the issues raised in this module and will take on board any recommendations from the inquiry to help shape future emergency responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your help, Ms Bernahan. Very well, we'll break for lunch now. I shall return at 1:45. Thank you.